Hello, I'm going to tell you in this video a bit about where user experience came from. That is quite a modern phrase. I don't think I ever heard anybody talk about user experience in this context before the early 2000s. And it certainly didn't become in common usage until really quite recently. Back in those days, what we talked about was HCI, human-computer interaction. And because, although they aren't the same thing, I thought it would be useful to tell you a bit about where HCI came from, because UX has very much evolved from HCI. So this video is about the birth of HCI. Now, HCI is based on the principle that if a computer system is going to do anything useful, it consists of both people and machines. It's what we call a socio-technical system. Let me give you an example of that. Supposing you're playing a game. We could represent that game with this sort of diagram. And you interact with the game using your actuators, your hands, maybe your voice. And what you do is manipulate various bits of hardware, and that generates input into the machine, and that processes the game logic. The machine generates output, which drives a different set of hardware, and you interact with that via your senses. Now, HCI is all about this interface here between the human and the hardware. Now, this in turn stems from what is called human factors. And human factors has been around for a while. It's the textbook definition of human factors it's the application of psychological and physiological principles, the engineering and design of products, processes and systems. When it's really about physical design, it's often called ergonomics. So if you are looking at the design of a chair, say, that's very much ergonomics. But when you're looking at the design of machines and processes, then it's called by this rather broader title, human factors. And human factors are all about reducing human error and increasing productivity and enhancing safety and comfort. Now, the origin of human factors was back in World War II, really in the aerospace industry. In World War II, fighter planes were getting very fast and very dangerous. And cockpits in particular are really complicated. This is a fighter cockpit of that era, and you can see there are a lot of dials and buttons and knobs which need to be operated accurately, quickly, under extreme pressure. And the designers of these aircraft discovered that making quite small changes to the layouts of things like cockpits and also escape hatches made a huge difference to the survivability of the planes. Now, you can look at anything that that humans interact with as tools, whether it be a computer or a fighter plane. And a lot of tools are what are called single-purpose tools. I mean, a good example of this would be a power drill. A power drill is very good at drilling holes. That's what it does. It doesn't really do anything else. You can't really use a power drill to cut wood. If you want to cut wood, use a saw. And so all the design of these single-purpose tools is absolutely dedicated to one purpose. But computers are different because they aren't dedicated to a single purpose. They're generalized tools. And that's a lot more complex to design for. Now, computers prior to the late 1970s were the domain of professional specialists and sometimes amateur enthusiasts. They were big, expensive machines, and anybody who used them was trained to use them. They weren't for the general public by any means. However, back in those days, there were a number of very smart people thinking about how humans could use them and how they might use them in the future. I'd like to say a little bit about just a few of these early pioneers of what later became called HCI. And probably the most important of them is somebody called Vannevar Bush. And most of Vannevar Bush's career predated electronic computers. He worked on mechanical calculating machines in the 1920s. But he was a very eminent scientist. He rose to being chief scientific advisor to the American president during the Second World War. And amongst other things, he was responsible for administering the nuclear bomb project. But he saw firsthand a modern bureaucracy, governmental bureaucracy, and that consisted of vast amounts of information flying around, far more than any one person could hold in his head. And he looked at this as a scientific problem. And just before the war finished, in 1945, he published an extraordinary paper called As We May Think. And in that paper, he proposed building a machine, a memex he called it, which would store all knowledge, that would store all the writings of the world and make it available. And he thought about how one would navigate that sort of vast information space. And a lot of the ideas in As We May Think eventually inspired the World Wide Web. And if you read this paper, you'll find there's quite a lot in it that is familiar. Now, another one of these pioneers is Douglas Engelbart. Douglas Engelbart was an instrumentation engineer, and he was working in the early days of computers. And in the 1960s, he started working out how people can interact with machines to try and achieve the sorts of things that he wanted to achieve and that Vannevar Bush had been working on previously. And Douglas Engelbart invented windowed interfaces. He invented the mouse to interact with windowed interfaces. He invented word processing. His very first mouse was made of wood, and you can see here he is holding his very first mouse. Another one of these pioneers was Ted Nelson. And Ted Nelson, really again working in the 60s, saw that you could use computer software that was just coming in then to implement a lot of Vannevar Bush's vision. And Ted Nelson designed a massive software system which again was linking together huge amounts of information that, although it wasn't ever finished, and to some extent it's still under development, it directly inspired the World Wide Web. So these pioneers are tremendously important, and if you find this stuff interesting, I can strongly recommend this BBC documentary. It's old now, I'm afraid, from 1990, but although the documentary the technology in it is ancient history, the ideas in it are still state of the art. And it's a fantastic documentary because you get to hear people like Ted Nelson and even Vannevar Bush talking about their ideas and things that happened. And also the documentary is written by Douglas Adams of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy fame. So it's tremendously entertaining and it's available on YouTube. If you're interested in where user experience came from and you've got an hour to spare, I strongly recommend watching this documentary. Now, of course, by the 1970s, computers stopped being the remit of trained professionals and started to become mainstream. And this is an Apple II. Apple have got a lot, as I'm sure you're aware, have been heavily involved in the development of HCI and user experience. And the Apple II was their first consumer computer from the mid-1970s. And the phrase HCI was popularized by Card, Moran and Newell in the title of this book in 1983. And HCI was really defined as the human factors of computers. It consists of a whole lot of theory, of methods of how you do things, and principles that you draw from that theory. And it became really an academic discipline in its own right, and it informed a huge amount of design and development. So that's my whistle-stop tour of HCI. Thank you very much for listening.